how things work without having to write a 45-page business plan. And so to answer your question now, the lean startup is a way to efficiently use time and resources with three tools: business analysis, customer development, and agile engineering. And it allows us to build new products and services much faster in less time and money. That's the answer to this short question.
And what's the difference between lean startup and customer development and design thinking?
That's a great question. I have to tell you, I was with that for a couple of years, and I'm like, wait a minute, I invented it. What happened? In Silicon Valley, and this is a Silicon Valley operation, companies will translate this as a silo, but entrepreneurs will recognize this. Most startups don't start by saying, I want to grow this through one. Now, for perfect world, it would. But most startups start with, I have a new piece of technology, or I have an idea for a product. It's not what the customer wants. I have a pretty clear definition of, I want to commercialize this technology, this product, or this vision. And now, what's worse is I get funded that the cost is on burn rate until I get enough customers as partners for the product is efficient. And so customer development is the process I intend to rapidly, with urgency and speed, find customers and markets when the starting point is product and technology. This is a big idea. But they take it for granted. The customer development says, I have a technology in hand or a product idea in hand. Whether that's right or wrong, that's how Silicon Valley tended to, and still tends, is to start companies. The design thinking starts from a completely different place. And again, where it started doesn't necessarily mean it has to be used here, but it started with large companies who already have customers, and consumer packaged goods companies. So gee, here are consumers, whatever. Can we find more products for these known customers? And can we do so by spending time with them, getting out of the building and doing what is called needs finding, and then building iterative prototypes, just like in lean startup customer development, where we build minimum viable products. Can we start prototyping until the customers we know raise their hand and say, boy, I'd buy a lot of that. And so the difference is the starting point. Customer development, part of lean startup, starts with product or technology in hand, looking for customers and markets. Design thinking starts on the other end. Says, no, I know these customers, they're mine, I already own them.
Sure.
I need to figure out what else I could sell them. Does that make sense so far?
It does. It does. It does.
There's one other component which really isn't a flaw in design thinking, but it just is. Because I invented customer development, I engineered in this notion of urgency. And by urgency, I mean if you're a startup CEO, you're waking up and going to sleep to three numbers. What's your burn rate? That is, how much money are you spending a month? You know, how much cash do you have left in the bank? And the exact hour, day, and minute you're running out of cash. And by the way, the consequence of those of running out of cash is not trivial. You not only shut down your company, but you might be losing your house or something else. And therefore, an integral part of customer development is urgency just isn't a phrase. It means you're making good enough decisions. And by good enough decisions in customer development, you're in fact basically segmenting decisions into just two categories: revocable decisions and irrevocable decisions. Revocable decisions are made in a single meeting. There's no scheduling another meeting to have a committee to have another meeting. A revocable decision could be what order are we doing the features, or which customers do we call on first, or even what's the pricing. An irrevocable decision could be, are we signing a 10-year lease, or are we taking money from these investors and giving away this much of our company? Those things are pretty hard to roll back. And those require, maybe a week worth of decision making. But in a startup and under customer development, the idea is speed and tempo. It's built into the process. Design thinking, on the other hand, and this is not a criticism of it, it just is, you can engineer urgency into the process, but in fact there's typically no fixed deadlines. Because in a large corporation, making mistakes actually could cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and therefore you want to gather enough data. And by the way, the consequence if you fail in a large corporation is you still keep your window office and your kids are still going to the same school. Maybe your project's over.
So,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. So Steve, link in this notion of evidence-based entrepreneurship because I know that's another foundational element of the fabric of your thinking as well.
So one of the things about the lean startup is that not only can we get out of the building, we can actually start accumulating real data and evidence very early about the decisions we're making. And so when I'm talking about good enough decision making, it's not just based on guessing, it's based on the fact that we're now talking to a ton of people. And for example, when I teach this lean process in a class, both at Stanford and Berkeley and Columbia and NYU where I teach, but also, just as an aside, the class has been adopted by the National Science Foundation and running as a pilot at the National Institutes of Health as the basis of commercialization of all science in the United States. What we do is we make our teams go out of the building and spend talk to 10 to 15 customers a week. So in an 8 or 10 week program, they've talked to over 100, sometimes 120 customers in an incredibly short period of time. And they've basically tested hypotheses and validated or invalidated them and have a ton of data points about all the components of a business model canvas. Is their product market fit? Is the revenue model correct? Is this the right channel? Have we A/B tested the user interface? You know, for medical devices, you know, do we have freedom to operate? Do we understand the regulatory environment? Have we talked to people who are going to be reimbursing us? You know, do we understand clinical trials? All these things are no longer theory. You can now go back to your investors, or in a large company, when this is run inside large corporations, you go back to management and say, we need more funding because here's the data we have that this might actually be an interesting project.
So do you have to construct iterative product releases with shorter development cycles in order to be able to solicit the feedback and have the agility to action your customer feedback and ultimately refine a product as you go?
Right. In fact, one of Eric Ries's major contributions, besides the others he made, was actually giving names to a lot of the pictures I drew in the 4 Steps to the Epiphany. The first one, I drew this line, but he named it the pivot, and I called something the minimum feature set, which he called the minimum viable product, which actually is a much better name. And these are 2 concepts that are integral to lean. The first one says, when you get out of the building and you talk to all these people, what really you're most likely going to find out is your initial hypotheses are wrong. Now, in a startup in the 20th century, you would find this out much later, and that would, in solving the problem, would entail firing executives. That is, well, sales didn't work. Obviously, the problem with the VP of sales, let's fire him or her. And the new VP of sales would come in and say, well, that was a dumb strategy. Here's a new strategy. It turns out now we make failure actually learning. That is, we assume that startups and new ventures go from failure to failure. That's a huge concept. We now know that that is the case. Almost, you know, you can count on like 2 fingers the number of startups that actually end up with their initial plan. And so what you want to do is do that learning. And when you make a major change to any part of the business model canvas, whether you're changing channel or customer segment, et cetera, we have a name for that. That's called a pivot. What a pivot is a substantive change to any component of the business model canvas based on customer data and real evidence. Not one data point, but I've now run a bunch of experiments, and it turns out this is wrong, or this is wrong, or this is correct. Those experiments are in the form of not only just talking to people, but iterative prototypes is almost too fancy of a word. Iterative experiments in the form of, could be a PowerPoint of an image of the product, it could be a wireframe, it could be a clay model of a heart valve or a catheter, it could be, you know, sample data for a therapeutic drug that you think you might get back from clinical trials and you're showing to a potential pharma partner, if I get this kind of data, is this valid, et cetera. And so we call these incremental and iterative prototypes minimum viable products. And there's not just one, there's a series of them, and they change over time. As I said, they could just simply start with a PowerPoint or a web page that says, if this is important, click here. to a wireframe, to a model, to a prototype, to eventually, low fidelity and then high fidelity versions of the products. And so you're constantly iterating. There's no longer this version of alpha test, beta test, first customer ship. That's a waterfall model. We use this agile engineering model, but we couple it with this customer development philosophy and the business model canvas that we're actually using agile engineering to test all of the hypotheses of the business.
Now, you're the Lean. Tell us more about the Lean Launchpad and the National Science Foundation Innovation Core and how they are applying it, because it seems like it's quite, on the surface at least, quite a big leap from talking with small groups of founders to now trying to apply this on a broader scale at basically a federal government scale.
Yeah, people forget that at times the federal government could be as innovative or more innovative than startups or corporations, and this is an example of that. The U.S. government is one of the leaders in pushing the lean startup philosophy and actually implementing it. What happened was, this lean startup theory was great theory. Here's what you do, and here it is on paper. But since I was now an educator teaching at Stanford and Berkeley, I was almost embarrassed. I was still teaching my students how to write a business plan. And we kind of know now that no business plan survives first contact with customers for an early stage venture. I mean, obviously at some point in time you need an operating plan, but a business plan, is really a 5-year plan of a series of unknowns. And the only people to require 5-year plans based on unknowns were the Soviet Union and venture capitalists. And we know how well that turned out for at least one of the groups. But even if you said that, the challenge would have been, well, so what's the substitute? What should we be teaching our students? And there really was no answer, so I invented one. I basically took the lean startup principles, business model design, customer development, agile engineering, and put together a pretty radically new class. Thank you, Stanford, for allowing me to do that in the engineering school, which said students applied as teams of 4, and in fact their application is a business model canvas that they've filled out, and we teach them theory every week. Here's what a customer is, here's what a value prop is, here's what channel is. But every week as we teach them that, they then need to get out of the building and talk to 10 to 15 customers to validate value proposition, customer, and whatever. So at the end of the class, they've talked to 100 customers and partners. And the final presentation is not a demo day. A demo day is a snapshot of, here's how smart I am, and here's my demo, and by the way, do you like my font and the fact that I use adjectives and I project my voice? But really doesn't tell you whether this team has actually learned anything,
Sure.
nor does it have any velocity or trajectory. And so what we make our teams do is, tell me what you thought on day one. What happened after you spoke to the first 10 or 20 people? Why did you pivot? What was that pivot about? Then what did you do? Well, then you did this. Well, then what happened? And in fact, in the same amount of time that a demo day occurs, we actually do a lessons learned day. And you learn a heck of a lot more about the team and the market and how did they get from here to here than a single snapshot. So what happened was I taught this class and decided it was so radical. I historically, and still have, open sourced everything I did. I blogged every class session. Here are my lectures, here are the student presentations, here's whatever. And what I didn't realize is back in Washington, D.C., all the commercialization program managers for the National Science Foundation were reading my blog like it was a serialized novel. Until the last class is over, I get a phone call that said, hi, we're from the U.S. government, we need your help. Now, because I'm still a smart ass, my answer was, the government got my help during the Vietnam War, you're not getting it anymore. I said, no, we're from the National Science Foundation. We've been, for the last 30 years, the Congress has mandated that we give away 3% of our budget to our scientists who want to commercialize their activities. And thank goodness Congress hasn't asked how well we're doing, because the results are worse than any venture capital return. We're essentially giving away cars without requiring driver's ed, and we're surprised that they crash.
Sure.
And so why are you calling me? We think you've invented the scientific method for entrepreneurship.
Wow.
Well, what does that mean? Well, Steve, you keep using the word hypothesis testing, That's what scientists do their entire career. What we realized is you just have a method that scientists and engineers would understand in 5 minutes. All we need to do is train them how to do it for people they don't know and would be uncomfortable talking to, but the rest they're going to get in 5 minutes, and it means we no longer either have to keep them in the dark about what makes up a company, or we no longer have to try to teach them how to be MBAs and income statements and balance sheets and cash flow when that's way too premature about whether they even have a business. Help us put together this course. And so we took my Stanford course, ran a prototype on 25 teams that the NSF selected as the best scientists they had who wanted to make companies out of their technology, and the results blew them away. And so we scaled the program. Fast forward 3 years, we've put over 700 teams through the I-Corps program, 400 net through the national program, and then because there are 15 now going to about 20 universities teaching this for the National Science Foundation, they've put through another 300 or so regionally. And then last month, our National Institutes of Health decided to, I prototyped a class for life sciences, therapeutics, diagnostics, devices, and digital health. Last year at UCSF, they thought that was so interesting that we're running a pilot now inside the National Institutes of Health, hopefully to scale it there. And then last week, the Department of Energy announced that next spring, they're going to take the same process and same course and launch it in the Department of Energy to commercialize all energy science. So it's kind of interesting.
So that's fantastic. That's fantastic.
We actually have some questions from Twitter.
Yep.
Okay.
So Mitch Lieberman asks, the lean startup method that you were describing, how does that work if somebody is if a company is developing a medical device, a heart valve, for example, where failure means loss of life? You don't just pivot quickly back and forth around that. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, so I get these questions all the time, and they're great questions, but they really confuse the distinction between, you know, the idea, the technology,
And
the heart valve,
and the business
with
model.
what does it take to build a heart valve company. So it might be you've already gone through all this stuff, but let me remind you, to build a heart valve company, you first need to understand, well, you know, do I understand who the customer is? And, you know, for my young students who confuse technology with companies would say, well, Steve, it's pretty easy. Heart valve, it's like my grandfather. Turns out your grandfather is not the customer at all. And then you kind of ask them some more. They say, oh, I get it. It's the doctor. And then you go, can the doctor put any heart valve in? No, I guess the hospital has to approve which heart valve. Great. You know, can the hospital pick any? No, I guess the FDA has to be involved. Right. Good. Do you know what kind of FDA approval process there are? Turns out for devices there are two, called the 510K or PMA. They're very different. Great. So how does your grandfather pay for this? Does he pull out his credit card? No, there's, I guess, an insurance company. Great. So there's reimbursement involved. Do they reimburse any new heart valve? Well, I don't know. Turns out you need to understand reimbursement codes and CPT codes and whatever. This is long before. Oh, by the way, now back to the valid question, which is, you know, like it's life or death. Great, you're going to be running clinical trials. How do you pick the right partner? What's the right data the FDA is going to require for what process? Unless you understand all those questions, all you have is a neat technology and a failed business. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Does this tie back to evidence-based entrepreneurship?
Yes, because everything I just described, you need to go gather evidence that your hypotheses of, you know, if I challenge you with all those questions, you might give me a set of glib answers, and I'd say, great. What data do you have that, like anything you just said, was nothing more than your opinion?
Right.
And it could be you say, Steve, this is my 5th heart valve that I invented. Let me tell you what I know. Holy cow, you just validated a ton of hypotheses for me. I would still say, let's very quickly run through this one. But most of the time I'm dealing with scientists or engineers who this is their first heart valve and have no idea about the rest of the components that differentiate this great piece of technology from how do I build a medical device company. And by the way, the other thing I would ask you is, and this is not to talk you out of it, but I hope you understand, the odds of you taking that company public as a endpoint for liquidity is about 0 nowadays. The odds are you're going to be acquired. So are you going to structure your company any different if, in fact, your realization is that the endpoint to medical devices is, at least this point in time, is an acquisition? Oh, very interesting set of conversations.
And this is why you've talked about getting out of the building being crucial. Can technology today, like social media, help accelerate the evidence-based process?
Well, it could accelerate the demise of your company when you think it can. So it turns out that, of course, using surveys and whatever is another form of data, but I kind of think of the equivalent of Maslow's hierarchy of quality of customer development data. You know, at the 100,000-foot level, there's like, you know, industry research, and then at a next level, there might be, you know, sales data, and then there's, you know, you're actively soliciting feedback via social media data, and then there's telephone or email responses. But I have a heuristic that says if you haven't cross-correlated all that data with watching people's pupils dilate when you ask them questions, the rest of the data is meaningless. Because human beings naturally will tell you what you want to hear. You actually want to watch body language, see if they're looking at their watch, you know, being glib. You want to challenge their responses. It turns out you can't talk to everybody, but unless you actually can cross-correlate those responses with literally watching people's facial and body language expression, you're going to get some really faulty data.
Steve, let's change gears slightly and talk about corporate innovation, which is something that you have become interested in. So to begin with, why have you developed this interest in corporate innovation?
Well, it's funny. Of course, my last startup was a enterprise software company, and you know, had an $8 billion market cap, blah blah blah, hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. By the time it went public, I retired. We brought in a great, you know, CEO and management team who knew how to take it to scale, and I went off to start thinking about startups. And to be honest, at the turn of the century, I read almost everything there was about entrepreneurship, and ironically, almost all the literature back then was about corporate entrepreneurship. And when I read about it, I said, well, this doesn't have anything to do with startups. I realized other than some books by Bill Davidow or Jeff Moore's Crossing the Chasm, there really wasn't a ton of literature and theory about entrepreneurship in early stage ventures. So that's where my focus was until, about a year and a half ago, Harvard Business Review asked me to write, how would the lean startup impact corporations? And given my background in selling to companies, I wrote an article called The Lean Startup Changes Everything. Ended up on the May 2013 cover of the HBR. And all of a sudden, I started getting phone calls from men and women whose titles I had no idea existed. They were the Chief Innovation Officer. And when I would ask, what the heck do you do? Half of them would be honest and say, we're still trying to figure it out. And what I discovered is that the nature of the corporation had changed dramatically in the last 15 years. In the 20th century, the shorthand is Jack Welch ruled, meaning, you know, be number 1 or 2 in a market, own share, you know, build defensible. But all those are gone. I mean, not because companies have gotten stupider, but because the world has changed. China's a manufacturer. China's a customer. Globalization. You know, new metrics like return on net assets and IRR. Companies outsource innovation and shut down R&D labs. Internet, makes branding, if not meaningless, less valuable. Barriers to entry have dropped dramatically. Some CPG company just showed me some data that, you know, the number of new products coming into their field, majority of them are now from new entrants rather than established corporations. Every large company is dealing with, my phrase, continuous disruption. And so therefore, for the first time in the history of a corporation, just in general, companies are now looking to startups to do continuous innovation. Because we, in fact, have to do that for survival. And for the first time, a number of large corporations are realizing they need to move at a speed they never had to do before, because historically they could own a market segment and defend it for a decade or more. That's almost impossible now, unless you happen to own the regulators and or politicians that go with them. We see that in a couple of cases, even in the U.S., but in almost every other market, right. You got to figure out how to innovate at a very different speed. And so now the question is, and here's the big idea, is in a corporation, we've spent the last century building execution tools, processes, and procedures that allow us to execute efficiently. It turns out that the tools and strategies and policies and procedures to innovate are the antithesis of those execution tools. And that sets up a real conundrum for how do you get the two to operate in parallel without screwing up your ability to make money. That's a real interesting problem.
So are you saying that execution efficiency can kill your innovation capabilities, or
yeah, kill is an understatement. Strangles it in the crib, and I don't mean by with any malice. It's by default. And Clayton Christensen, who I think direct descended of Schumpeter in terms of strategy and understanding this in corporations, articulated this brilliantly in The Innovator's Dilemma in the 90s, and I think we're still working out some of these processes. I think it has taken the tactics of lean startups to kind of start articulating what are the actual tools we would do to solve this problem. It's solvable, but we need to understand that, as Christensen rightly pointed out, it's even got worse in the last 15 years, that all the things we do, the HR manual, the comp plan for sales, the branding guidelines, I mean, just make the list. Everything, puts a roadblock into innovation that startups don't face. And that's the irony. That's why startups can move so fast.
Is this why, should we expect a trend where large companies are going to break up into smaller pieces? Because frankly, it's given the innovation velocity, it's just impossible to meet the market needs if you're a large company?
No, I think what we've seen is various experiments without people actually quite articulating, oh, what do they do? So, for example, starting in the 1950s, Lockheed invented the notion of a skunk works. A skunk works was a way to take advanced corporate R&D, but not just R&D, unlike Xerox PARC, but R&D with its own sales channel and its own ability to deal with customers directly, still make it part of the corporation, but not screw up Lockheed's normal, fighter plane and commercial airplane production. So Skunk Works was one corporate attempt to solve the how do I make innovation an integral part of the company but not screw up my execution engine. In the 1980s, when Gerstner took over IBM, he also figured out how to put innovation back in the divisions. And by the way, in the 70s and 80s, Chuck House at HP figured this out. HP forgot to tell anybody that they actually figured this out. And now in the 21st century, the best examples are, at least from tech, Amazon and Apple. Continuous innovation. In fact, these are companies who are not only innovating new products, but not afraid to be the ones obsoleting their own. Netflix being another example. These are companies that have figured out that you can chew gum and walk without shutting your company down. The antithesis is the media companies, and certainly the content companies who forgotten that the business is content. And you could, by the way, tell the distinctions between those two classes of companies. When the CEO is an ex-CFO and the board is staffed by MBAs and finance people, and you don't have product people either running the company or on the boards, then the incumbents tend to fight by being rent seekers and trying to win by regulation and politics. The others, who are run by product people, or at least have product people on the management team and boards, tend to win by innovation. And that's a really interesting battle in this country.
So what is the best way then to help companies with disruptive innovation?
So I think what we're seeing now is kind of a wave of taking some of these lean tactics into large companies. And the first wave is kind of funny because obviously a lean startup inside a large corporation is going to last about 5 minutes if you don't understand both the politics, the processes, the procedures, the KPIs, and the goals of the corporation. I mean, you end up with something I call innovation theater, which is, let's put on an incubator as corporate staff. And my test for those is, so what happens to those teams that graduate from your corporate incubator? Are they adopted by the business units? And the answer usually is, we're still working on that, which means we really haven't attacked the hard problem, which is how do we get business units or functional units to kind of like buy in first to this is an integral part of the company's survival strategy rather than some kind of theater we're making the press and board feel good that we're doing something about. There are companies that actually have managed to integrate this in top to bottom, and I think are starting to make some substantive change. You know, the work I started at GE and then Eric Ries went in and turned that into a corporate-wide program for General Electric. I think it's right now the current gold standard for GE's FastWorks for what's happened across that company. But surprisingly, other companies are doing this, and government agencies that you wouldn't believe have adopted this process. In fact, the government has something called the Digital Services Playbook,
Yes,
which is a great example of the most massive bureaucracy in the world figuring out here's the handbook for start doing these, and even more so how to do contracting with the lean processes. And it's called the TechFAR FAR handbook, and you would go, this is from where? It's the government.
Yeah, 18F, but the criticism that you hear about 18F and the Digital Services Playbook is that it's all fine and dandy for these smaller projects, but in the government you have to face these massive multi-billion-dollar large projects, even if you break them up. So how do you reconcile that? Basically, the scale.
Well, usually the people who object are the ones with the multi-billion-dollar contracts.
Well, there's a point.
Not everything can be made iterative and incremental, and obviously some things are, and I'm groping for which ones. I mean, my favorite example is the new air traffic control system, which has been, coming soon for the last 15 years. If you look at some of the disasters that happened, which, name of company I won't mention, got the billion-dollar contract, they forgot to actually ask the air traffic controllers whether the new UI on the system was something they would actually care to do or care to use. Turned out they had to re-engineer all this because they confused the functional spec with user needs. So I'm not particularly sympathetic for, well, these are billion-dollar projects, can't be broken up, until we've had the conversation of, well, which parts can you break up, and have you actually talked to users and other stakeholders in the process? Most of these large government contracts are the goal seems to be to get the contract, not to satisfy user and warfighter needs, for example. I see it a lot in the military.
Well, Vivek Kundra, the former CIO of the U.S., who works at Salesforce now, coined the term the IT cartels, basically.
Yeah. And so you really need to think about which side do you want to be on. Do you want to, make products that delight people, or do you want to just win orders for your company? Now, if I'm a corporate executive, I'd answer the latter. If I actually cared about, for example, for the federal government, if I cared about the country, I'd be answering the former. And that's, I think, the creative tension in not only the U.S. but in other countries. And as I said, for our country, the battle we're facing, take a look at Tesla or Airbnb or others, is, incumbents versus innovation. You can't support both out of both sides of your mouth if you're a politician. Because incumbents tend to win with being rent seekers or regulation or owning politicians. But if you're interested in job creation and innovation, then you're going to come down on the side of entrepreneurs and startups, except they don't write huge campaign checks. This is something that the startup community is going to have to learn how to do, because we still have a deep pockets democracy. But this country does this better than probably any other. If you, in fact, want to see countries where corruption rules, then it's almost a direct correlation between corruption and lack of innovation, because you strangle innovation by giving it to the incumbents who could pay the highest bid for keeping their spot on line.
Where do you see the future of corporate innovation, let's say in the next couple of years, and what's the role of corporate VCs during that period?
Yeah. So I have this hypothesis that if I was a hedge fund, I started thinking that there are two types of companies. Ones which have a 10-year trajectory of executing off their current product line, and I either go long on them as they scale up and will short them as they start collapsing from competition. Or there will be others who are literally mastering continuous innovation. That is, continually coming out with, process improvements or business model improvements or disruptive innovations. Again, the Amazons or Apples. And I think those companies will have 30 or 50-year trajectories. And you'll bet very different on those. For example, that's what a Tesla looks like. Tesla is, you're not betting on the fact that this company is going to make 35,000 cars this year. You're betting on the fact that these guys are going to be a serious contender that in 10 years will be making 1 million cars. That's a very different bet than just a short-term startup. Corporate VC kind of fits in with corporate M&A and also innovation. As long as these are silos, M&A is one silo, corporate VC is in another, advanced R&D is another, you still have a 20th century model of what innovation looks like. Doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means if you're competing with somebody who's actually integrated all the pieces, you're going to be screwed.
Wow. It's that's 45 minutes, and we could go on for a long time.
That was an incredibly fast 45 minutes.
I think we're in an exciting time. If I was in a corporate organization, I'd really be thinking about not lean or any of this stuff. I mean, those are just buzzwords. I'd be thinking about what does competition look like, and why are we getting our butts kicked, or what's going to happen when we start doing that? Do we have an infrastructure to be responsive? That's when I start looking at those innovation tools from early stage ventures and how to apply them.
Other than your book, are there books you can recommend to our audience for them to read?
Sure. Well, the first place I would start with, seriously, is at least for innovation as we know it now, I think the texts or the original Clayton Christensen's Innovator Solution and Innovator's Dilemma. Of course, I would read Eric Ries's Lean Startup. I would read Alexander Osterwalder's not only a book on business model design, but his new one, which is Value Proposition. I think there's a set of books for corporates that I would read. The Other Side of Innovation by Vijay Govindra and Chris Trimble. The Future of Management, Gary Hamel. Winning Through Innovation by O'Reilly. And again, another basic text that when I started thinking about customer development was actually the only one I thought was quite useful, which was Lead User Research by Eric von Hippel and Mary Sonak, and also The Sources of Innovation by von Hippel. And there are other texts as well, but those are kind of the ones that I started with and kind of helped me think through what innovation looks like. And then Rita McGrath's new book as well. Rita McGrath from Columbia, and I got to apologize, I'm blanking on the name of that title. But there's about 5 or 6 things I would be reading to just kind of think about, holy cow. Here's the problem, if I can. I'll just this in 30 seconds. If you got your MBA anywhere longer than 5 years ago, most of the knowledge you have is about execution. You're screwed, truly. Not because they were teaching you something dumb, but that the world has changed so radically that the courses you took really didn't describe the world of continuous disruption, and didn't, in fact, start building a set of tools for corporate continuous innovation. Go show me a business school that has a certificate in corporate entrepreneurship. The ones that start offering that will be the places I'll be. If I was running a company, I'd be sending my execs. And eventually they will. You'll start seeing those, I'm sure, from probably, my guess is, first Stanford and then others. But corporate entrepreneurship needs to be a core curriculum of business schools in the 21st century, or they're going to become obsolete.
Well, Steve, I tell you what, as you were talking, I've just been exchanging direct messages on Twitter with Alex Osterwalder. And so we are proposing, and this is on, so I'm going to put you slightly on the spot here. We're proposing a CXO-Talk show with you, Alex, and our mutual friend Evangelos Simoudos, who is an expert on corporate innovation, to talk precisely about and explore in more depth these corporate innovation topics. So what do you think about that?
I think that would be fun. I'll just be quiet and learn from Alexander and Evangelist.
Actually, I'll be quiet and learn from the three of you.
I'm just typing away.
Vala and I will simply take notes.
I'd invite Rita McGrath or any of those others as well from who actually do the consulting in this space as a living and as writing. I mean, you could the list of people I suggested were Christensen. I mean, that would be a fun set of conversations about really what the future of corporate innovation looks like, not just in theory, but what are some actual practices that you could go do, and how do you start? One thing to kind of understand that you need to start from the board and CEO, but are there some things that some teams could do right now inside of R&D or engineering or anywhere else? And the answer is yes. I mean, there's lots of ways to start. In fact, probably the worst way is to have some corporate fiat that says, on Monday we're an execution company, and Tuesday we're innovative. So now everybody be innovative. That's going out of business.
Yeah, I think we've heard some large enterprise software companies talking that way recently.
Yeah, I think that just doesn't take into account the nature of work and how human beings operate. And by the way, my 2 cents is, in a large corporation, again, this is an insight I got from Christensen. Most people took a job in a large corporation because they do want to go home at 5. They don't want to take home work with them. Yet, if you want to do innovative new things inside a corporation, you need to find inside your company the 5 or 10% who are crazy people, who maybe have different financial goals or needs than those who are betting their entire mortgage on a startup. But you will find equally innovative people inside of large corporations, but they're not the entire company. And so the question is, how do you build those teams, and how do you not, when you build those teams, have them alienate the people who are actually generating the revenue and profits for the short term, and how not to set them up as us versus them, but set them up collaboratively. I think that's where this gets fun.
Well, we're going to explore this more.
Okay.
We have been talking with just a phenomenal discussion with Steve Blank, who, as I think we all know, is the founder of the Lean Startup movement and just a great influence in the world of startups today. Vala, what do you think?
I couldn't keep up with all of Steve's words of wisdom. I think for the first time I'm struggling on Twitter capturing all of it. So, Steve, incredible insight. Thank you very much. It was really an honor to learn from you. Great.
It was fun being here. And I'm not sure there's any words of wisdom. I think there are a lot of words. We'll see over time whether it's wisdom, and I think it's up to your listeners to figure out how does that apply to them, and to start thinking about, are there things they could be doing differently today, particularly in corporations, to kind of adopt some of these ideas, and where would they start?
Okay, everybody, that's it. Next week we are off for Thanksgiving, so we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you especially to Steve Blank, and I hope everybody has a great weekend. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.